Hi there, I'm David Hunt, owner of GameMasters Guild, and I'd like to welcome you back to another Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition showcase. Today we're going to take a brief look at the Dungeon Master's Guide. Now it's true, in my last videos I said that you really only need the Player's Handbook, and you really only need the Player's Handbook and the Essentials Kit. That'll get you by just fine, and the rest you can kind of finagle. But honestly, if you're going to run Dungeons & Dragons hardcore, you need the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, and the Dungeon Master's Guide. What's so special about the Dungeon Master's Guide? Well, it tells you a lot, and I'm going to go over that real quick with you. First of all, it'll definitely address how to utilize the Dungeon Master's Guide, because there's a lot of information in there. It'll discuss your role as Dungeon Master, as well as interacting with the different types of players that you're going to have. You have players that really want to focus on storytelling, others that want to focus on acting and role-playing, others that focus on exploring, and others who just enjoy the thrill of combat. And there's even more types of players than that. And it'll touch briefly on how to interact with those players. And to me, a good game of Dungeons & Dragons, or any role-playing game, sprinkles a little bit of all this in there, so everybody gets a little bit of everything. Sure, some days there'll be more role-playing than there will be combat, or more combat than there is storytelling and role-playing. But a good game tries to touch on all these elements during each session as best as possible. Now, what else does the Dungeon Master's Guide offer? Well, first of all, right off the bat, Chapter 1, it discusses world building. It talks about the big picture, it talks about the deities of the universe, whether or not you want to use them, languages, different civilizations, campaign events, your play style, different tiers of play, and the different flavors of fantasy, like sword and sorcery, for instance, or high fantasy. There's all sorts of different types, and Dungeon Master's Guide addresses all of these. And you're probably talking like 20 solid pages, just a Chapter 1, of good solid material for world building. And they address a little bit of everything. They don't just focus on one thing and that's it. And this is very useful. And even now, as an experienced Dungeon Master, I find that I want to refer back to this section just as a little refresher. And it's kind of nice to go back over old material that I know I've read 1,000 times, but upon rereading it, sometimes it makes me think about my current game and like, well, you know, maybe I could adjust it and make it just a little bit better. And then, of course, jumping off that is Chapter 2, Creating a Multiverse. It talks about the different planes, planar travel, astral travel, the ethereal plane, going to the Feywild, the inner planes, the outer planes, and even some of the known worlds of the material plane. And I tell you, in Dungeons & Dragons, there is so much to do, so many places to go. Blow your players' minds. And this is another good section to reference. And granted, they don't go super in depth, but definitely just enough to really hook you in and give you a firm foundation to, if you want to go to the planes, then you can take your players there. And in each section, when they're talking like about the elemental plane or the Feywild, they give you some places of interest, some places of note that maybe you could center your adventures around. Now, they won't have a lot of specific detail, like they won't detail out the city of brass, let's say, but at the very least, it gives you a brief synopsis of it, so you can still utilize it in your game and you have a basic understanding of about what to expect and how to set it up for your players. Now, in Chapter 3, talks all about actually creating adventures, and tells you about elements of a good adventure, tells you about published adventures, adventure structure, especially if you want to build your own, the different types of adventures, complications that can occur during adventures, as well as create encounters and random encounters, and the benefits and detriments of all these kind of things. And of course, what good adventure doesn't include some great NPCs? Chapter 4 discusses all that. Designing NPCs, NPCs as party members, hirelings, extras, villains, even villainous class options, which is kind of cool. And there's a lot of neat material there that you can really utilize. And what's neat is you don't necessarily always have to have just a monster as a villain. You could literally take the Player's Handbook, make up another character, level them up to a certain level, and just have that person be evil. You're like an evil wizard, your classic evil sorcerer in a tower somewhere, you know, or maybe an evil fighter who has gathered a small band of brigands and raids the countryside and keeps the locals frightened, you know. just even simple characters like these could be terrifyingly difficult for players to fight and find, especially if they're not a monstrous character. They could easily slip in and out of society and get lost in a crowd, and the players would have a hard time finding them. Whereas Beholder, can't really miss a Beholder in a crowd, but a person in a red cloak, he can drop that cloak, get some different clothes, disappear, change his appearance. Next thing you know, he vanishes. Chapter 5 is all about different adventure environments, such as dungeons, wilderness settings, settlements, and how to map out each of those. And it discusses each of those kind of environments and gives some random tables to help you kind of put these things together. It goes over urban encounters as well as unusual environments and such things as putting traps in your game. And there's a decent section on traps, and I gotta tell you, it's very nice. So the time in between adventures can be just as important as the adventure itself. And the Dungeon Master's Guide addresses this. It talks about how to link your adventures together, also too, how to track your campaign, as well as reoccurring expenses your players may have, a good way to spend all that gold, like if they have an airship or, maybe they have a building that they own, upkeep costs and maintenance, and also too, downtime activities. What are your players going to do when they're not on adventures? How do they get the items that they get? They don't always find everything in a dungeon. How do players get that fancy cloak with all the hidden pockets, or how do you get that cool sword that's got that neat little thing you press and boom, a dagger comes out the hilt? How do you do that? Well, this happens during downtime activities, and there's a lot of different things to do, and the book addresses that. And of course, how do players get all this cool stuff? Treasure. And the DMG is full of treasure tables and how to get treasure and how to spread that out amongst all the players. It talks about magic items, sentient magic items, even more powerful artifacts, and as well, sometimes gold isn't always glory. Sometimes there's other things, such as medals of honor or parcels of land. So the DMG gives you a lot of other ideas to reward your players with. The Dungeon Master's Guide also discusses table rules. What are your rules for your particular group? It's going to go over the roll of the dice, using ability scores. It's going to talk about exploration. It's going to talk about social interaction. It's going to talk about combat. It's going to talk about interaction with objects, like if you want to break down a door, what's a wooden door's armor class and hit points? It's going to go over that kind of stuff with you. It's going to go over chases and how to manage chases if you're not too sure how you want to do it. And if you want to do big stuff, like let's say your player's tower gets under siege, or your players are part of a siege, it discusses siege combat. It even goes into very interesting things like diseases. Oh, how do you fight a disease? Oh, that's interesting. I mean, figure your players are out in all these mountaintops and swamps and on the ocean for weeks, and you might catch some. So it goes over diseases, and sometimes they can be just as dangerous as the monsters they fight. And of course, sometimes poison. That's right. It goes over all sorts of poisons. There's plenty of different poisons, and if you're a rogue, poison is one of your things that you're going to use, or quite possibly might get used on you. There's some pretty insidious poisons. And of course, sometimes during an adventure, they might run into things that's so mind-blowing that it could actually cause madness. And that's even addressed in the Master's Guide as well. Now, all these adventures, over all this time, players will inevitably build up experience points. And again, the DMG will go over some more about the experience points and the system. In the back of the Dungeon Master's Guide is a special section called the Dungeon Master's Workshop. And here, this is where a lot of optional special rules reside, such as being able to use a proficiency die instead of a straight proficiency bonus. So at low levels, you have a proficiency die of 1d4 instead of +2. And then at higher levels, instead of a +3, it's +1d6. So that's kind of interesting. There's also something like background proficiency, where let's say you're a noble, and your background is a noble, and you're in an environment where you're talking to a bunch of other nobles in a party, and you try to make a persuasion check, but you don't have proficiency in it. But you get to argue to the DM, hey, I'm a noble, I'm in this kind of noble setting, we're talking about things as nobles, so I should be able to argue that my proficiency bonus should apply in this case. And the DM, he can decide whether or not your explanation or whether or not your justification is valid. And of course, the DM always has the final say in any kind of arbitration. But in something like that, that seems pretty reasonable. And of course, as players, they're going to have to remember that you are the final arbiter, and what you say goes. If it doesn't apply, it just doesn't apply. There's also some other cool things like hero points, where, for instance, at lower levels, you can have 5 hero points, and anytime you roll a die, but before results are applied, you can spend a hero point to roll an additional 1d6 and add it to that total. And at higher levels, you get more hero points. So, kind of interesting, kind of fascinating. I think I like it. And there's also something else where there's 2 new ability scores. With one, which is honor, and the other, which is sanity. So that's kind of interesting. New ability scores to add to the ones that you already have. Very, very cool. So let's take a look at what else the Dungeon Master Workshop has. There are also some interesting adventuring options, such as adding fear and horror, or changing the way healing works in the game, such as being dependent on a healer's kit. You have to be healed by a healer's kit before you start spending hit dice, or perhaps your healing is slower, or maybe you get a healing surge during combat. Or there's also making things more gritty and realistic by having players heal at a much, much slower rate. Another possible addition is plot points, where you can change the course of the plot. Also, firearms, explosives, as well as, not to mention, alien technology. Now, of course, these are very small blurbs in the back of the book. They're completely optional, so I don't feel like you have to use them. But it's kind of fascinating because even with this little bit of information, it's possible that you can make whole new worlds built on just this little bit of extra options. There are also some interesting combat options as well, such as altering your speed factor depending on what weapons you're wielding during combat, basically generating like encumbrance for combat, or different types of actions you could take, such as mark or disarm, some very interesting kind of things. Now, of course, the DMG, these are just very small sections in the back of the DM's workshop, but there are some bigger sections as well, such as creating a monster. It actually discusses about creating monsters all on your own, taking a creature from the monster manual, altering it, or making something up entirely on your own and how to do it, as well as creating new spells, creating magic items, as well as even more new character options that you could create all on your own. Oh man, I tell you, the Dungeon Master Guide is much more full of information than most people realize. Most people get the Dungeon Master's Guide because it has magic items. But it's much more than that. The Dungeon Master Guide is so much more than just magic items. There's a lot of awesome information, a lot of great information, some optional that you could even throw into your game and make your game even better. I really think the Dungeon Master's Guide really makes you want to up your game. There's a lot of cool information. Don't feel like you have to use it all at once, but definitely study the Dungeon Master's Guide and, work on some of these things. Pull out some of this extra information. Make your game better. And that's what all these books are about. And honestly, that's what it's all about. It's having fun, having a great time, giving your players a great time. And the more fun they have, the more fun you're going to have. Well, that's just about it. There's only a couple more things, such as monster lists, like what monsters reside in grasslands, some random tables. There's an appendix with maps in it, as well as an appendix for some inspiration for Dungeon Masters, as if you don't already have enough already, right? But hey, it's always nice to have more inspiration, always. And of course, an index to make it super easy to help you find stuff in your Dungeon Master's Guide. Well, there's certainly a lot. I covered a lot in a short amount of time. I tell you, you really got to get a Dungeon Master's Guide because it's only going to make your games better. Well, again, I guess that's it for now. I'm Dave Hunt, owner of GameMasters Guild, telling you to stay safe, play great games,